Welcome to this session here regarding decarbonization of our building stock. We have a number of good speakers here with us today, and we will have a few general introductions. And after those introductions, we will have a good panel debate where it is also possible for you out there to join in and to raise questions. You simply just raise them in the chat, and then we will take them in the end of the meeting. Should you have some? Otherwise, I will moderate, so I will take care of some good questions to the panelists. We have Brian Motherway with us, who will start introducing the program. He's from IEA and head of the energy efficiency program. And then we have Ingrid Reumert Velux, Vice President for External Relations and Sustainability. And then we have Celine Carrère with us also, Saint-Gobain, Public Affairs, Global Public Affairs Saint-Gobain, and also Vice Chair of the European Alliance EURACE, which you represent here today. And then we have Lorenzo Bagliano from the Politecnico di Milano, and he will talk about some of the projects that they are doing in reducing CO2 from product materials. And I assume that we will also have Asma Kahaldun joining us as well. Brian to present what the IEA has of news here.
Thank you, Kurt. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm actually here with Kurt at COP, where there's a lot of really exciting buzz about some of the pledges we've seen in the last few days and some sense of forward momentum. But at the same time, even though we're seeing a lot of new pledges for net zero coming out, emissions are actually going up as we speak. In 2021, CO2 emissions will increase by 3 or 4%, one of the highest increases in decades. So we're not on the path yet. And if in the next slide we can talk about what that path looks like, because the IEA has published a roadmap to 2050 to imagine what a net zero pathway can look like, and to explore all the options, all the actions that governments need to take to deliver on the stated targets that they have made in the recent months. Buildings, of course, are central to that. There are many key milestones starting very, very quickly, where buildings must really move towards a super high levels of efficiency and, of course, clean energy supply. Next slide, please. This, of course, covers the building envelope itself, where we see that by 2050, most buildings are either built to zero energy, zero carbon standards, or retrofitted to that standard. And there must be major progress on that even in this decade between now and 2030. And equally, looking at the heating equipment, we see a shift away from the world today driven by coal, oil and gas, to massive electrification, specifically through heat pumps, as well as penetration of district heat and other technologies. It's important to stress that 2050 can still feel far away, but action really has to start now, especially in a sector like buildings, where change takes time, turnover is in decades, not in years, and therefore the task is really urgent. Next slide, please. One of the great benefits of starting early with energy efficiency is it is available now, and it's job creation intensive. And that's why we see gratifyingly that many economic stimulus plans that we've seen recently have emphasized not just clean energy, but energy efficiency. And investment in energy efficiency, particularly in buildings, creates a lot of jobs, and that brings additional benefits. Next slide, please. Policy is key here, and we see that when policy is put in place, it really does work. And we look at building energy codes around the world. When mandatory codes are in place, buildings become much more efficient. And we know that here in Europe, where buildings are vastly more efficient than they were even a couple of decades ago, driven by building energy codes. And yet there are many parts of the world where the codes either are not in place at all or are still quite weak. The other side of the equation, of course, is appliances. Next slide, please. And this is something we have been concentrating a lot on recently in the IEA, including work we've been doing with other collaborative colleagues to look at the impact over time of appliance energy efficiency programs. And the headline here is that countries that have had appliance programs in place for decades, the longest running appliances, have had really tremendous success in reducing energy demand from appliances. And those with longest running appliance programs are seeing that actually typical appliances like refrigerators, televisions, cooking devices are using half the energy they otherwise would be if they hadn't seen those efficiency gains in the last few decades. And yet their purchase price is actually lower than ever. So consumers are gaining from lower purchase price for appliances, but also lower running costs. And that's something that is really important. And that's why just yesterday here at COP, we, along with the UK government, launched a new product efficiency call to action that looks at 4 key energy using technologies: motors, lighting, refrigerators, and AC, which between the 4 of them account for more than 40% of global electricity use. And a group of large countries ranging from India and Indonesia to Japan, Germany, Brazil, and others signed up to a pledge to aim to double the efficiency of the key appliances between now and 2030. So I think that's going to be a very significant driver of action in the coming years, and we're very pleased to be part of that. Finally, in the next slide, please. While we talk about the typical kind of efficiency thinking around end use, let's also think about how the nature of energy efficiency is changing in the context of digitalization. And so it's not just how much energy an appliance or a home uses in a year, but it's time of use, location of use, and the ability for the demand side to become more flexible to unlock the availability of variable renewable resources, but also optimize the whole system in a way that benefits consumers, benefits the whole system, and of course reduces emissions. We've been very pleased to be working with the G20 on this topic this year, led by the government of Italy as G20 president, and we produced some new analysis on a particular focus on cities in the context of smart technology, smart grids, and how cities can be a leading actor here. We're looking forward to continuing to work with all the stakeholders involved in this event and indeed in building efficiency more widely. So Kurt, thank you for the invitation to participate, and I hope those opening remarks have been of interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Brian. It was extremely interesting to see your slides, and I would like to come back to later on in the discussion that we will have what we should do on the building side when we talk about standard and labeling. You showed those good examples of on how other areas have progressed, and I would like to hear your position on what can we do when it comes to the building sector. And then I would definitely also like to learn a little bit more about the report that you mentioned, if we have time for that as well. Let us move on to Ingrid Reumert, who will talk about a kind of overall global perspective on how we should look at buildings through their lifetime, from manufacturing of materials to products to use in the buildings and to end of life. Over to you, Ingrid.
Thank you very much, Kurt. And I also believe I have a few slides. So, and thank you, of course, for the ability to participate in this event, and great to see known faces already here. So good to see you also. But please change to the next slide, which is very much an introductory slide. And of course, most of you here will know these numbers, the difference between the energy use and the emissions and how much buildings occupy. But it's still my experience that this cannot be repeated enough, not least because in a number or in a lot of national statistics, the building sector kind of disappears into other sectors. So I think it's important to keep on repeating these numbers, and as we want to decarbonize other sectors as well, what role buildings can play and building actors can play in a general decarbonization. But if you click to the next slide, yes. And what I believe we're increasingly seeing across a number of countries is an expansion of our perspective of buildings. We have for decades been focusing on the operational efficiency, energy efficiency, also of course operational carbon. And we're increasingly seeing the need to expand our perspective on buildings to include the entire life cycle perspective. And of course, one reason for this is also that as we will green our energy system, for appliances, for example, or mainly, of course, in the beginning, electricity, as mentioned by Brian, the operational carbon will become smaller, whereas we can expect the embodied carbon to be relatively larger, because those processes linked to the embodied carbon might be more difficult to electrify. So I think there we will see some different proportions moving forward. Next slide, please. So we have to, of course, get used to seeing buildings in this entire life cycle perspective. And the reason for that is also, of course, that the building sector is maybe more a chain or a value chain than actually a sector. And we know that if we have, and we do have to have the whole sector, the whole sector should move, with the sector needs to move at the same time. Because if not, we know that the responsibility for where to reduce and who actually has the responsibility to reduce the CO2 and of course some initial cost, of course investments longer term can be passed on from one to the other. So I think what we will increasingly see is, of course, this common language of CO2 in a life cycle perspective emerging, both for manufacturers but also for other actors within the building sector. And with that, we can take a collective responsibility, whether it is for the manufacturing as a manufacturer like Velux, or whether it's in the design process, building process, or later on and at the end of life. Next slide, please. And looking at a company like Velux, we are of course a building component manufacturer. We produce roof windows. From our own perspective, of course, we operate scope 1, 2, and 3, as a lot of companies have started to use this methodology. For us, the distribution of CO2 is 6% on scope 1 and 2 and 94% on scope 3. So of course, if taking our responsibility seriously means that we have to work, of course, on the scope 1 and 2, but definitely have a large responsibility also to bring down the CO2 in the entire value chain, since it constitutes such a large part of our total CO2. Next slide, please. You can click one more, because this is maybe an introductory slide. So what we're looking at from our side is to work on all phases in the building life cycle. We have launched a sustainability strategy a year ago, setting ourselves the target of becoming lifetime carbon neutral, which is a new concept where we take responsibility both for our past emissions, so our historical CO2 emissions, all the way back from when we were founded in 1941, but also reduce significantly moving forward, taking responsibility for future emissions in line with the Science-Based Targets Initiative and the 1.5 degree trajectory. And of course, this means that we will have to, and we will engage at all parts of the building life cycle, as you can see here. We've already started intensive work with our major suppliers of how we can collaborate and work together on bringing down what is our scope 3, but also, of course, in the use phase and at the end of life, there will be work to do, and we are looking forward, of course, to working with partners within the sector to solve this this challenge. So, all in all, if we succeed as Velux when we arrive, excuse me, oh, sorry, I just lost my voice. That's real life. Sorry, I lost my voice. I'll be very quick finishing. I was almost done. When we arrive at our 100 years anniversary in 2041, we will be what's called lifetime carbon neutral. I think I'll stop there and then take a glass of water. Thank you. Sorry for that.
Thank you, Ingrid. And I was going to hand you a glass of water, but I can't do it from here. It was very interesting, and I think what is something which we could take with us also for the future is that it looks as there's a need for the for the whole supply chain to work together to reach to the or to get to the carbon neutrality objective that we have in front of us. But I would now like to move on to Celine, who would give us a deeper dive into what is going on in the use phase of the building, because it's not only about the building materials, it is definitely also about making buildings energy efficiency and potentially also to grow the renovation rate. Celine, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes, good. I'm very glad to be here with you. Thanks for that. You can move to the next slide. I'm today representing Renovation, which works at European level to express the benefits of energy efficiency in buildings and work out what policies can best enable to unleash this full potential, which is still very big. And you can move to the next slide. Yes, I'd like to give you in a nutshell what we're expecting from the current policy environment. There is definitely a momentum with the EU Green Deal, with the Fit for 55 and the Renovation Wave launched a year ago. No, you can go back. Yes, thanks. And here a few drivers that we believe should be put in place, given the enormous potential we've heard, and Ingrid showed some of the numbers, but we need to keep in mind that 40% is still the energy consuming buildings, and that is linked to the fact that most of them were built before building codes were in place. You can still go back to that previous slide, thanks. And there, yes, in a nutshell, we have the Energy Efficiency Directive, where a huge driver should be to renovate all the public buildings, not just the central ones, roll out the energy efficiency principle. But then we are expecting, and we are very excited about that, the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive, which should come at the end of the year, where for us, new drivers would be with regulatory measures for existing buildings on the top of financing and support measures that would come together. The deep renovation standard should also be defined, the strengthening of the long-term renovation strategies. And obviously, the transparency on what buildings actually consume is super important. Lots of progress has to be done, has already been done, but much more can be done with energy performance certificates. I will focus on 3 of those. You can move to the next slide to remind the huge opportunity we have with a proper rollout of the energy efficiency first principle, which I remind is about planning and factoring in the energy efficiency benefits sufficiently upfront for them to become concrete. Too often it comes at the end of the project or at some point in a policy process, and that needs to be placed in front. Why? Because it will benefit everyone. It will benefit the kids in school to be in better places, the people at work for better productivity, but also it can really help with the energy poverty throughout the union, for which you see a visual here. And energy efficiency first is also a true added value for helping to transition our energy system. It can really help make the whole system more flexible, but also less costly in this transition. So much more work has to be done. The Commission has just published that guidelines. Much more work needs to be done to work out what still stands in the way to deliver the proper energy efficiency principle. So we're busy with that. The other point of focus, and in the next slide, please, I'd like to mention is the minimum energy performance requirements, where we call them MAPs. It's a bit of a jargon, but what it is all about is to have a new dynamics for existing buildings. We have a great dynamic in Europe with for new buildings with the NZEB standard, which have been rolled out, near zero energy building standard, but the same kind of dynamic is still missing for existing buildings. So the whole purpose is to signal ahead to the whole value chain what type of improvement should be performed in our existing buildings from an energy performance perspective. It's important for for the owners, it's important for the finance sector, it's important for the industry, for everyone in the sector. And the idea is to roll them out first for forest performing buildings, to make sure also that sufficient support scheme would be in place, to make sure also that they can link up sufficiently well with Brian Motherware was explaining, which is to make all the buildings zero carbon ready. So the link between minimum standards and the deep renovation is very important, but also to roll them out for every segment, because every segment has its own dynamics, and the value chain needs to be embarked in that change. So we have really lots of expectation on that. And the final point I wanted to focus on for today is on the next slide, is the long-term renovation strategies. So on the next slide, yes. The long-term renovation strategies have been an exercise that have been performed by European member states a few times, but I think it's time to inject a bit more of strategic thinking again in this tool, because it's really crucial if we want to get to grips with decarbonizing our building stock. So a few areas of further effort and in-depth preparation would help them become more than a paper, but really operational strategies, where the mapping, for example, of the building stock should be much more granular and specific, also using digital technologies, where the approaches and the policy that works needs to be leveraged per segment or also per areas. So that work is possible. We also need to have strategies that really work out the synchronicities and the links between all the technologies for the envelope, the active technologies, also the digital technologies, and also to enforce skills upgrade to make sure that this is also better mastered by professionals. This really a holistic approach. And for that, maybe common templates should be developed that would also help different EU countries to look at what the others are doing, and yes, best practice sharing will be key. My final slide is just to conclude and say that yes, the energy efficiency challenge remains a top priority, because in existing buildings, this is what makes the greatest share of today's emission. The next challenge, obviously, will be to embrace and consider the whole life carbon impact of buildings, for which common EU framework is needed, and using common standards will also help appreciate, understand the challenge, move on, benchmark, but also set up the right policy framework. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Celine. It was a pleasure to follow, and I think you have some good points on why we should renovate our existing building stock. And the worst thing to do when it comes to carbon is to tear down an old building and then start building a new one. It's much better to renovate the existing one that one has, and then make that as energy efficiency as a new building. That would, from a global perspective, be the best solutions. And then I think when we come to the panel debate, I think you have a lot of questions also to Brian around standard and labeling, because I think you also see that as a driver. But let's move to the final presentation, which is more kind of a practical example, a research which is made. And I would like to ask Asma Khaldoon to give the presentation. And you were not here in the beginning, so please introduce yourself as well.
Hello, I'm Asma Khaldoon from the University, from Al Akhawain University in Morocco. I will be presenting my work today on bioclimatic materials, that is in the framework of the Africa-Europe bioclimatic building for the 21st century. So on this project, we try to answer this question, how to design with use of natural solution. Of course, this is not an easy subject, as we can see from all your introductions. So for that, we have like a consortium from different institutions, like research institutions and also companies to work, architects also to work on this subjects. Please, we can move to the next slide. Maybe to the two next slides. This is just the work packages that we are doing. So this is the consortium, and then we go to the third. Okay, you go to the third. Okay, so this is mainly our work package. The first thing that we did is we tried to make a review of the infrastructure for the production of this kind of bioclimatic buildings. So for this, we did our research, and we tried to come up with a list of all manufacturers, the ones that are making the products and the ones that are making constructions. So please, you can go. We also looked for green projects in Africa and Europe, so to learn from their experiences. So this will facilitate the research for anyone who wanted to do these constructions or learn about them. So therefore, by countries, you can have the name of the companies and the people involved. So please, you can go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so our second task of the project, because we are a research institution, mainly actively working on development of bioclimatic materials for construction. So we were tasked to do the review and the analysis of all bioclimatic materials that exist until now. Okay, please, you can go to the next slide. So normally what we did in our research is we did an intensive bibliographic study to see all the bioclimatic material that we can found. So basically we can divide them on three parts. You have the earth-based constructions, like the unfired clay bricks. You have the stone construction and also the rammed earth. So you can also found some construction material that are from plant origin, like the cork, the bamboo, the wood, and the hemp. So also the straw. And in the other hand, you can also found the materials that are from animal origin, like the wool. They can be also very interesting as insulation material and also as a stabilizer. Okay, so the way we described the composition and so on of these materials, then we looked for their properties, basically the thermal and the mechanical properties, to see their suitability of application and where we should implement them also on the building, in the constructions. Of course, following the regulations to see where we can really implement this kind of material. The obtainment process, or the process of fabrication, is also very important because it also affects the properties. We also looked for the construction practices and methods and tried to gather them. Another point that we also focused on is the cost assessment of this kind of the production and also the implementation. We looked also for regulations for bioconstruction materials. So that means that the regulations that are really specific with this kind of constructions. So as a conclusion, what we said, the regulations that there are really lack of regulations in this kind of constructions that are really for this construction. Another thing that we can say that really this kind of materials really are really very promising. And of course, we can see that we can even have several stories, buildings with earth constructions, like 4 and 5. So we saw some case studies, and of course, from the properties, we would expect that we can reach this kind of stable constructions. Another very interesting think also the mechanical properties are also improved by adding additives. So this will really open a lot doors for a lot of innovations and brings to the market many products that can be low carbon products and also improved energy efficiency and the comfort inside the buildings. Okay, and thank you.
Thank you very much. It was extremely interesting to listen into, and it's interesting to see that you are identifying a lot of new materials that you can use, which has a low CO2 impact. I would like to say that I think that there's also a lot of the existing materials which has a low CO2 impact if the companies work in their full supply chain. So. But it is interesting, and I'm looking very much forward to the discussion that we should have now. We have sent out 3 questions to you. I am not sure that we can get through all of them, but the first one which comes to my mind, and it's also the first one we have sent out, it is how can we develop policies and legislation so that we can meet those ambitions that we have on energy efficiency and on carbon neutrality. And I would like to start to ask Brian about his thoughts, because you also pointed out that that standard and labeling was a way forward. I'll just mute myself so that.
Standards and labels really work. You know, we've seen that across the world, whether it's building code, regulation works in buildings, in appliances, in vehicles, in other sectors. In some parts of the world, regulation's a bit kind of out of fashion, if you like, and some countries don't like putting it in. Let's take appliances. In the countries, as I said earlier, with the longest, strongest appliance standards, energy efficiency has doubled, and therefore appliances are using half the energy. And yet more than half of all appliances in the world are not covered by any standards at all. So we have a real gap there. These kind of conventional instruments work really well. Same with building codes. For the future, as we look for deeper gains in efficiency, as well as applying those kind of measures, we need to think about the new policies that will be driven by digitalisation. I think this is where something does change. As well as applying the conventional instruments more strongly and more widely, we need to think about what are the new policies that will bring these dynamic and systems gains to efficiency as part of an electrified, low carbon, more dynamic, more integrated future driven by digital technologies. We're already starting to see certain electricity markets, you know, starting to monetize or regulate in the value of demand flexibility in a much more dynamic and digital driven way. And for me, I think it's an area that needs more attention to really think about the policies that we need to avail of the opportunities that digitalization give us, while also protecting consumers in terms of data protection, cybersecurity, and other questions that arise.
Thank you, Brian. It's interesting to hear your position on or your recommendation on the dynamics and the digitalizations, because that is something which is for sure coming up in all other sectors, and why shouldn't it also come up in others? In our Ingrid, do you have any thoughts on what is needed on policies and legislation?
For sure, yeah. Thank you for that question. And maybe building on Brian's point, because of course I also fully agree with the appliances possibilities, but also the potential of digitalization in terms of steering our energy consumption, and we will need that anyway when we're going to 100% renewable, which is not always or not necessarily so stable to start out with. But I think I can come with an example of what we have done in our in my home country, Denmark, in terms of CO2 requirements for buildings, and we have set 2 types of requirements. So one which is in the building code itself, which will be effective as of 1st of January 2023 for new buildings over 1,000 square meters. But then we've also set a more ambitious threshold, which is a voluntary standard that one can adhere to if one wants to go beyond the legislative requirement. And I think that model works because it enables both to have those who are more ambitious and who want to have maybe customers who want to really move forward with the green agenda, they can follow the voluntary standard, which will be tightened towards 2030, but having a legislative requirement which is not as strict, at the same time ensures that we can get all actors included in this big change, because of course we know that the building sector, we have a lot of small and medium-sized companies as well, who at least to begin with will have some challenges in terms of getting the CO2 data in place and being able to work with this whole new terminology that we're building on. So I think that could be a model, working with the two different thresholds, and then of course tightening both of them towards 2030. And then maybe one more point, if you will allow me, I would also advocate for looking into active building design. So I think we have a possibility to really revitalize some of our old building principles, where we design our buildings to start with in relation to the climate and ensure, for example, the orientation is correct in terms of where the light comes in, and north facing, south facing, etc. Our ability to utilize natural ventilation, so we have natural cooling. We know how to do that, and we know how that can work as a hybrid solution, possibly together with AC or other kinds of cooling. But I think we also have a challenge, and it's not just the designers and the architects who have that, but maybe also within legislation to open up also to these active building design and possibilities of using the design itself to lower carbon.
Thank you, Ingrid. I would like to move to Celine now, because you also have, Celine, in Euroace and probably also in Saint-Gobain, where you also work, some thoughts on what is needed to develop the right policies and the right legislation, not only for buildings themselves, but also to grow the renovation rate further, so we can reach the 2.5% or 3% in 2030.
Yes, thank you, Kurt. I think, yes, what I would like to underline is maybe two things. One is the synchronization of the different tools that we have. I mean, in renovation, obviously, financial support is key, and it can be delivered from the EU level, national level, local, and that is essential, especially to encourage everyone to embark in a renovation project. So that is one thing. But then we also need to mix that with a supportive hand. We call it technical assistance or local one-stop shop that are available. And the financing part and the support part needs to be linked up sufficiently well with the regulatory dynamics, in order for people, when offered those supporting tools, know that this is also something that at some point will also come from the regulatory environment. And this is something that has not yet been in place. And our expectation, as I was mentioning, are really high, that the renovation wave and the revision of the various European directives are going to, let's say, to really crack it. So that's one thing. But then we should not also forget about the skills. I mean, getting from 1% renovation rate in Europe to 2.5 or ideally 3% to renovate our entire building stock, we need people, we need skills. I would like also to underline the needs for people coordinating those projects. There are millions of little home renovation projects for home and any kind of building, in fact, and to make it correctly with the right level of ambition, but also to deliver what needs to be delivered on the ground. So not just to plan it, but also to do it with sufficient quality, sufficient depth, for example, needs coordination. And that coordination has not yet existed in the market. This is quite, I would say, an exciting thing to do, not only for one building, but also to link building together that have the same characteristics. And that can actually also be driven and encouraged by digital tools, because when you know, for example, in a local area, what kind of buildings there are, and then which one can be done together, then you can go much faster with the deployment of the strategy.
You mentioned digital tools. I know that there have been several discussions around digitalization of the energy label and to use that much more active. Have you any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think now it's not going to be very helpful if people get what is supposed to describe their building in a folder of 25 pages. So yes, digitalization of those tools aimed at delivering transparency is very important. And I would say is digitalization together with integration of what those tools can actually do. So we have energy performance certificates. Ultimately, they could become an app on your phone or another platform, and that can be linked with different things. So integrating the picture of today's buildings with a projection of how it can transform would be very powerful, and it's actually explored in some markets. Linking that also with building renovation passport. I didn't have time to mention it, but this is also super important to keep in track, and also in some interactive manner what's happening now and next.
Thank you. It's interesting to listen to. I would now like to move to Lorenzo, which we have not heard from, but he will represent ABC in the panel session that we have here now. And Lorenzo, do you have any thoughts on how to work with policies and legislation and how we should develop that, also taking into consideration the presentation we have just had? And then I would also here like to mention that supplementary materials used in, for instance, no, I will come back to that. Any point from you on policy and legislation?
Yeah, I would certainly connect to something that has been proposed, for example, by Brian on the importance of regulation, labeling, and on energy efficiency first, mentioned, for example, by Celine. This regulation can deliver an efficiency first if they are very clear. And now we have a very clear language, which is, for example, set explicitly in standards like the EN ISO 52000, where the overall performance of building is clearly described by 3 indicators: the energy needs, which is really the measurement of how good is the thermal envelope, how good is the recovery on of heat on ventilation. That's really the key start. If the design, as Ingrid was saying, is done badly, if we don't design well the envelope, or we don't retrofit well the envelope, then everything else can't follow. On the contrary, if we do a very good envelope or a very good retrofit, and now we can do retrofit which deliver the same performance as a new passive house or Minergie house. We have hundreds of examples where we can take a very bad old building and transform it in a high performance, high comfort building. Then it becomes also flexible. It doesn't need to be heated every morning at 7 in the morning or be cooled at 4 in the afternoon in summer. You can decide when to deliver energy, so you can accommodate energy from renewables, which is coming not in a predictable way. You can include the controls and connect to other buildings. If we don't do this physical step first, we can't do the rest. If we do that well, we can do all the rest and include the entire chain and the entire building industry and the controls into this powerful transformation. So that's what we try to present in also in ABC 21, which has to do with bioclimatic architecture. So we start from the basics, and we have a number of reports on these indicators, which go much in the line of what Brian was saying: standards, giving a framework to the industry on how to design, how to communicate the results, how to assess the results in a very clear, very transparent way. And we should have this into policy. We should have this into the revision of the directive now. Annex 1 should talk the language of standards, of the 52,000 and the other standards, so that we can communicate between states and between continents, and we can talk with ASMA very clearly and be understood and understand what ASMA is saying. So that would be my main take. And I think we can do really well if we make right this framework and this language. And energy needs for heating and cooling, the main metric to describe the performance of the envelope should be in Annex 1 very explicitly, not only total primary and non-renewable primary, also the energy needs. And we have reports in ABC 21 trying to explain really in detail, and webinars where we go deep into this and we try to visualize this.
One thing that I would like it's maybe challenging the discussion that we have now. It is that if we start using new kind of materials or reuse materials, then we also have to be sure that the overall sustainability performance of those products are correct. I know that there's a lot of discussions around environmental product declarations. Are they correct or are they not correct? And if we bring in new materials and we evaluate new materials, they should also be evaluated in the same way. Have you any thoughts on how we can work with environmental product declaration in the way that we put all products equal, so to speak? Lorenzo?
Still for me. Okay. Yeah, on this, we have an entire line of research. In ABC, we have a line of research on future weather for design, because that's another boundary condition. We need to have these future weather files for designers. But one line is the one that ASMA is following, and is on materials. And it's certainly not easy to have have this standardization on this variety of materials which are locally produced. So there are many variables, but there is progress on this, and there are a few institutions in Africa and also, I guess, also in Europe. There are a few. I don't want to mention someone to forget someone, but we are trying to let's say bring connections between those activities, and we hope in the next phase of the project to be able to give you concrete answers to this issue of how we characterize those materials in a better and communicable way.
Thank you. I would now like to move to the next question we have prepared, and that is back to renovation, and how we can use renovation to fulfill the net zero 2050 target that we have on a European level. And Brian, IEA have made some thoughts how we can get there. Can you share with us some of the thoughts that you have on how we can get to net zero in buildings in 2050?
Thanks, Kurt. Without oversimplifying, the world divides into places where we're still building large amount of buildings and we're not building large amounts of buildings. Because let's remember that in the emerging and developing world, the rate of build is the equivalent of one new Paris worth of buildings every week. So we're still building a lot of buildings and infrastructure. And of course, they're going to lock in either efficiency in low carbon or inefficiency in high carbon. And that's a real important space for the future of building efficiency and building decarbonisation. But of course, in Western Europe, that's quite different. And the rate of new build is very, very small. And in the timelines we're talking about, in the next decade and the subsequent decades, we will only decarbonize buildings through a very aggressive renovation program, much higher than has been achieved to date and much higher than anybody has achieved. The Europe's ambition, which is very laudable, for deep renovation of buildings is at a scale and pace that we have never, ever done before. I think it's very laudable. I think there's some really good plans in place, but it's not without its challenges. And in my view, I have to say that sometimes I feel the conversations can be a bit technical, a bit supply side. What are the solutions? What are the financial solutions? What are the policies? I'm not sure we always talk enough about the homeowners and the citizens and the occupiers and what's going to motivate them to participate. We need very large numbers of either renters or owners participating in deep retrofits, which involve significant financial commitments, significant inconveniences, significant changes, and it's at a scale, as I say, that is unprecedented. So let me put it this way: I'm looking forward to watching Europe work in this space, because many people in the world are going to learn from the experience here. But for me, I still think there are some questions about the delivery in terms of citizen participation, homeowner participation, that are not fully resolved yet.
I'm just unmuting myself again. But I would like to ask if I think you have presented a roadmap on 2050, and I can't recall if you have mentioned exactly what is needed for renovation. What kind of renovation is needed to reach the 2050 target? And the same with what is needed in new buildings to reach the 2050 target. Can you elaborate a little bit on it?
So we separate the two parts of the world, as I said, between the more advanced economies where building stock is largely mature, and parts of the world where it isn't. But in both cases, by 2030, we effectively, in every part of the world by 2030, more or less, we need to see that all buildings being built, all new buildings, need to be what we call zero carbon ready. And that means two things. One is very, very efficient, to the highest standards of efficiency. And secondly, ready to deploy clean resources as they become available, even if they're not fully available at that moment. For buildings, of course, we believe, as I think many do, that's going to be driven by electrification of heat to a large degree. I think heat pumps will be a key technology. There will be places where solar thermal will be important, district heating, bioenergy, maybe hydrogen in some places, depending on the local economics, because the hydrogen is maybe more economically viable in larger scale applications like industry, but it might have applications in certain cases. Similarly for cooling, let's not forget about cooling. The cooling is the fastest growing electricity demand in the world, because every second 4 air conditioners are sold somewhere in the world, and right now they're not particularly efficient, and that needs to be a really strong early focus. Then on renovation, particularly in the developed world, we need to see renovation rates doubling or tripling before the end of the decade, and renovation to this zero carbon ready standard. So if we think about the zero carbon ready standard, applies to everything, new build and renovation, certainly by 2030. And in the most developed economies, we need to see renovation rates doubling, if not tripling, within this decade.
Thank you, Brian. I think we have a challenge in front of us, and as Celine mentioned, we also need to educate a lot of craftsmen and engineers and architects in this process that we are seeing in front of us. I would like to move to you, Ingrid, now, and ask you if you have any thoughts on what is needed within renovation in order to reach the net zero target in 2050. And a supplementary question from the chat, which I would like to ask to you and also to Celine. It is, how do we calculate transport of materials when we calculate the CO2 emissions from the materials? How do we integrate transport when we calculate the CO2? Please, Ingrid.
Yes,
first.
Thank you very much, Kurt. But maybe if you allow me, just following up on Brian's point about new build and in the developing or emerging markets, and I think that's also why the importance of companies, large companies who produce building components or even raw materials, of them signing up to the Science Based Targets Initiative is so important. So I would just say it's not just a question of legislation and policy. It's also a question of, I think, the largest companies, and of course some of those who have very CO2 intensive production, signing up and committing themselves to decreasing, because that will have a of course, an effect, whether it's renovation, but definitely also within the new build sector. And then, of course, you mentioned renovation. What can be done to spur it? I noted, of course, on Celine's slide around the Fit for 55 package. There was also the mentioning of the multiple benefits. And I still think there is a huge untapped potential in terms of engagement with citizens and whether it's homeowners, building owners, or people who are renting, in terms of linking the overall CO2 agenda to, or climate agenda, to the difference that they will feel in their everyday lives. And we've spoken about this for, I think, a decade. And I even remember, I think the IEA did a report on multiple benefits in 2014, if I remember correctly. So it's not a new topic, but I think also with all our discussions around just transition, I think we can really also, as players within the building sector, lift this topic up and take it much more seriously. So the whole multiple benefits, whether it is in terms of course, energy poverty, as mentioned by Celine, or also, of course, health, inclusion, the communities, etc. I think there's really some work to do there. And maybe the IEA will do an update of the 2014 report at some point. That could be interesting to see with the new knowledge that we have. And then you had a final question. There was a question from the chat around how to account for transport of building materials. Was that it?
Yes.
How it is included. So of course, for any company, it will be included either in depending on if it's your own transport. So it will be in your scope 1, or if not, it's in the scope 3. Of course, if it is a supplier, or so. And I think the answer there is that all that transport needs to be electrified, just like anything else. So we can decrease also the carbon there. I think for Velux, our transport of our materials accounts for 11% of our total CO2. So it's not a massive amount, but it's still enough to take it seriously.
And that can lead to Celine, because I think you can supplement Ingrid in her points here as well. And then, Celine, there's also a question for you in the chat, if you can manage to get that in 2 minutes also.
Yes, okay. On this transport dimension, yes, I mean, what Ingrid expressed is correct in terms of accounting for it. I think it also has to do with when we look at where we are at European level in terms of policies. Most of the policies today at building level encompass the operational dimension. Moving to whole life dimension and accounting for materials is the next step, starting with common tools for assessing products, and then buildings, and that link will be essential. And other than that, on the transportation dimension, I think it reminds us about the importance of embarking the whole value chain. I mean, taking my Saint-Gobain hat here, it is a matter of engaging with the transporters, with all of the actors on that chain, and I think that dialogue is really accelerating, and that's very important as well. And can you spell maybe for me that question on the chat, Kurt, please?
I will see if I can find it. Yeah, it's the early stage of marketization of the certificate you were talking about. Is it certificates like the one we have on renewable energy guarantees, or is it carbon credits?
Yeah, just to clarify, the energy performance certificates I was mentioning was referring to the European framework linked to the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. So the energy performance certificates that have to be displayed on a number of buildings, and also at key transaction points, and widening the availability of that information is first very important, while strengthening the reliability of the tool and also making it digital, just to clarify what I was talking about. Thanks.
Lorenzo, we have less than 1 minute left. Can you quickly give your final point?
Sure. I expand on this issue of the regulation and the net zero is obviously an important keyword, but we should be careful in defining it well. In many cases, in regulation is defined in a non-physical way, like you send in summer electricity to the grid and you get it back in winter with no losses. Obviously, that's not physical. The grid cannot be a infinite storage with no losses. It has losses, and doing this interseasonal implies a lot of storage or losses and materials and land and so on. So again, we should define not net zero in a physical way with all the losses, and this will bring us to the need again to reduce the final use, to start at the root and reduce energy needs of the envelope first, so that we need reduce and we can manage in an effective way and still do all the other things that are needed along the way to the final primary energy. But at the moment, I see two problems in the way we define things. That can be corrected.
I will stop you here because
sure.
I will stop you here, but because it's not correct what you're saying. It is very correct what you're saying, but the time has ended. I would like to thank all of you for giving your input. It has been a pleasure. It has been easy to moderate this session here, and I would have hoped that we have had 2 hours instead of 1 hour. And thank you very much for everyone who had listened in abroad on Zoom. Hope you have enjoyed it. Bye.